I'm really struggling with how I feel about The Last of Us Part 2. On the one hand, there is no denying that when it succeeds, it is one of the best narrative-driven action games that has ever been made. But it doesn't just succeed. As both a game and a story, it stumbles quite a bit, and the hyperbolic cries of perfection that are out there really just seem weird to me. The Last of Us Part 2 is a deeply flawed experience, one that strives to achieve thematic depth within its story, but that often gets in its own way when it's telling that story. If you haven't played it yet, it's definitely worth you going out there and doing so and forming your own opinion. For myself, I find I'm more in line with the reviews that rate the game at around a 7 or an 8, much more so than the aforementioned hyperbolic ones. And to explore why, this is your official spoiler warning. I'm about to dive headfirst into the game's biggest spoilers, so get ready. 3, 2, 1. So Joel, the main character of the first game, dies really early on, and you spend much of the second half of the game playing as a totally new character called Abby. And to be clear, neither of these are the reasons I have issues with the game. But to get into what I think the game achieves for its story and where it fails to deliver, I'm gonna have to divide this discussion up into sections. And first up, we've got the big surprise herself, Abby. Just a quick editor's note before we dive into the review. Some of the people who didn't like the game have been responding in a rather toxic way. So let me be very clear, you are allowed not to like The Last of Us Part 2. But if you think sending the people who made it rape threats and death threats and racist messages is a way to express that feeling, it's most certainly not. And if you are one of those people, I recommend that you stop watching this video. If you are subscribed to me, unsubscribe, and also probably seek professional help. So, early on in the story of The Last of Us Part 2, Abby, a newly introduced character, brutally tortures and murders the main character of the first game, Joel. Not only that, but she does so in front of one of the main characters of the second game, Ellie, who sees Joel as a father. This is, of course, very upsetting, not just for Ellie, but also for the player, who, in the previous game, pretty much was Joel. And so both you as a player and Ellie as a character begin to blaze this brutal path of revenge to punish Abby and her friends, who, again, violently tortured and then murdered this father in front of his daughter. But halfway through the game, there is a perspective switch. You're taken out of Ellie's shoes and out of her quest for revenge and put in to Abby's. You are now playing as the person who killed Ellie's father. When you do, the story sends you and Abby on a quest that is very similar to Joel's in the first Last of Us. Both of them are pretty bad people who have done some really bad things in their past. Even the people they have in their lives who are familiar with them don't quite know what to make about their distant attitude and bloody behavior. But that all changes when they both meet a younger character who changes their perspective. For Joel in the first game, it was meeting Ellie, and for Abby in this game, it's meeting a young boy called Lev, who is trying to escape a fanatical religious cult that he was raised in. Much like Joel at the end of the first Last of Us, Abby ends up betraying the paramilitary group that she's agreed to work with in order to save her young protege. They both end up slaughtering their way through dozens of people to ensure that their children get to safety. And it's after she's done that that Abby's story reconnects with Ellie's at a key pivotal confrontation. And now that we have walked in her shoes, we are meant to feel much more empathy for Abby. The problem for me, though, was that it was too late. The game had done far too good of a job as selling in Abby as this terrible person that it couldn't undo it. Of course, there's the start of the game with the obvious torture and murder of Joel, but that's not all. Following what Abby did to Joel, we see that her own group of friends are shattered and broken by what happened. Her former friend, Mel, literally says that she wants nothing to do with Abby and the darkness that she has inside her. Mel rightly predicts that everything Abby touches turns to shit, which is prophetic because Mel and every single one of that group of friends end up dying, while Abby survives. At the same time, through flashbacks, we see that Abby's singular obsession with revenge costs her the chance of love with her friend, Owen. He is now with Mel, and she's pregnant with his baby. But after she's completed her quest for revenge and Joel is dead, Abby seduces a drunk Owen while he's in the aquarium, which is their spot. This is after spending most of that day with Mel, Owen's girlfriend, trying to convince her that she's a good person and that they should be friends. Not only that, but the very next morning when Owen tries to communicate about what happened, Abby totally shuts him off and refuses to engage in an emotionally intelligent discussion. And lastly, and most importantly, several characters across everyone Abby meets repeatedly reinforce that she is a bloodthirsty killer. It's said time and time again that she is one of the best killers in the paramilitary group that she works for, the Wolves. This viciousness is on full display as not having changed at all when she finally confronts Ellie in the theater. She's holding a knife to Dina, Ellie's girlfriend, who is pregnant, and when Ellie tells her that Dina is pregnant, Abby's reaction is to growl in this horrific kind of guttural phrase, "Good." It's fucking horrifying, and the only reason that she doesn't commit this terrible, violent act out of sheer malice and spite is that her young protege, Lev, is there, and he tells her not to do it. Abby is a fucking monster. The game makes that clear, and I'm pretty sure Mel calls her one directly. And so by the time the game's story made me start to walk in her shoes about halfway through, it was really obvious to me what the game was trying to do. It was trying to make me feel for and humanize this monster. But because I was so aware of who she was and what she had done, and because the game was so transparent about what it was trying to do, I refused to let it work. I was resistant to the concept at the start of her story, and that kept up all the way to the very end of her story. When Abby and Ellie finally confront each other at the theater, I let Ellie kill Abby, and I cheered when she did. But unfortunately, the game had a different story in mind. Abby wins their fight, and the only reason she doesn't slaughter both Ellie and Dina is because Lev tells her to walk away. And so she does. I really appreciate what the game was attempting to go for here. It's trying to show you that at either end of a cycle of violence, there are people, fully realized people who have their own families and lives and passions. We are all the heroes of our own story, no matter which side of that story we fall on. For me, her saving of one child couldn't possibly make up for all of the terrible things that she'd done beforehand. And what really, really upset me when I was thinking about this issue after playing through the game is how simple a fix would have been. So simple, in fact, that the game's story would basically not have had to have changed at all. The only thing that really needed editing to make this work was the story's structure. We should have played as Abby first. Instead of the game using the shock value of Joel's death for its narrative opening, it should have given us a quieter start in Abby's shoes. We start playing immediately after she's already gotten revenge. Pretty much exactly where the game picks up her half of the story. The characters all reference this terrible thing that she's done, like they already do in the story, but we don't know as players what that terrible thing is. All we know is that this group just came back from some trip where something really bad happened. With that key piece of context missing, we'd be far more likely to be willing to see Abby the way the game wants us to see her. She's this person who's done terrible things and is trying to atone for them. She's trying to find redemption. This would have made me buy into the character of Abby from the very start, and I wouldn't have been fighting with the game's story. Not only that, but as the breadcrumb trail slowly started revealing what Abby had done, I'd be far more likely to view things from her perspective. The game would have successfully built up this complex character that we truly empathize with, and that would have made it really difficult to watch as all of her friends slowly begin to drop dead around her. So when we, as Abby, finally reach the theater to find this person who's been killing all of our friends, and it's revealed that that person is Ellie, the main character, or one of the main characters of the first game, that would have been a truly shocking twist. Our whole world and interpretation of the story would be turned upside down, much more so than the twist of having to play as Abby from the halfway point of the game. Instead, the twist of having played as Abby all this time, that the protagonist of the game we were playing was the villain to the heroes of the last game, would have been a truly shocking and fantastic narrative moment. This seems like such a simple and effective fix to the dissonance that I felt when I was playing the game that I highly doubt that it escaped the minds of the people who wrote it. Like, I came up with this in the shower, and the only practical reason that I can come up with as to why they wouldn't have told the story this way is that at the end of the day, The Last of Us Part 2 is a commercial product that needs to hit sales targets. It would have been much harder to market The Last of Us Part 2 as a game about a whole new character called Abby, and to then surprise people halfway through that game with the returning characters of Joel and Ellie. So in making the brave decision to ultimately try and humanize and create this complex character out of the killer of the last game's hero, the people behind the game should also have made a brave decision with the marketing. They should have said that The Last of Us Part 2 was a whole new story in the Last of Us universe, unconnected to the first one. All of the trailers and the gameplay showcased ahead of launch would have revolved around Abby instead of Ellie. But they needed fans of Joel and Ellie to pre-order the game. They have sales targets to hit, and it probably would have been impossible to hit those pre-order targets without telling people that the characters they love from the first game are back in this one. Of course, this is all speculative from me, but it really seems obvious that the best structure for the story this game was trying to tell would have been to play as Abby first. And so the most obvious reason for why that decision wouldn't have been taken is monetary. By structuring the game so that we'd play Abby's section first, getting invested in her character and her relationships, before pulling the rug out from under us and showing what she'd done to Joel, we'd be much more likely to be willing to see things from her perspective, to see her as this flawed and broken character rather than as a monster. But in its current form, the game never convinced me that Abby was anything other than that monster. And when Ellie let her go at the end and sail away, I couldn't help but resent her. She got to have her revenge and a happy ending. She sails away with her new best buddy to Catalina Island. despite all of the horrible things that she's done. Meanwhile, Ellie makes the choice that Abby couldn't. She lets the person who murdered her father go. And when she's sitting there in the waves in that moment, it feels like she's lost. I really, really appreciate how the game was trying to make me feel for Abby. But in the end, as it's presented now, it just doesn't work. And for me, it's simple. We played the story in the wrong order. But that's enough about Abby. Let's get to the tragic hero of this piece, Ellie. The character of Ellie is where The Last of Us Part 2 really succeeds. Where in the first game she is a surrogate daughter for both the character of Joel and the player, here she is developed into a fully realized, complex human being. She is the tragic hero of this story, but like many tragic heroes, that doesn't mean that she's always righteous or valiant or moral. In her quest for vengeance against Abby, she often chooses the darker path, but by the end of the game, she pulls herself back from the brink. In a story full of violence and hatred, its final moments reveal a deeper, more hopeful message. One of forgiveness. That is The Last of Us Part 2's major theme, and that is where it succeeds the most as a narrative. Through Ellie, it paints a dire warning of the cycle of violence that we see reflected in our modern times today, both on major national scales and smaller, more personal ones. But by its end, the game portrays the light and the hope when someone chooses the better path, the path of forgiveness. The journey from that first dark place through to the light at the end of the tunnel isn't always comfortable or even fun to play through. But in both its light and its shadow, Ellie's journey is nothing short of powerful. A narrative tool that the game often uses to frame Ellie's journey is that of flashbacks. For me, each of these is among the best parts of the entire game. Not just because they give us a deeper picture of who Ellie is as a person, but because each consecutive flashback also totally recontextualizes how we view Ellie's journey of revenge through the core narrative. One of the first ones we see is also my favorite in the entire game. It's Ellie's birthday, and Joel takes her to an abandoned science museum. While they're exploring the initial dinosaur exhibit, we truly get to see how their relationship has evolved from the first game and has now truly become a father-daughter relationship. Not only does this section show us how deeply they care for and love each other, it also shows us how intelligent and creative Ellie is as a person. All of that culminates when they go to the space section of the museum. There they both enter a replica capsule of the Apollo 11 rocket, and once inside, Joel hands Ellie a recorded tape with the audio of the Apollo 11 launch. She closes her eyes, the ambient sounds cut out, and we get to see this whole scene from within her imagination. The thrill of the countdown, the rumbling as the rocket engines begin to power up, and then the lights and the flare as the rocket launches off into space. As all of that is happening in her imagination, we see her face just light up with joy and imagination. It is such a beautiful, truly, truly beautiful moment. Not enough can be said about how good this sequence is. Everything from the animation to the dialogue to the acting, everything here is perfect. And to bring it back to the darkness, all the more so because it shows us what Ellie lost, what was taken from her. And the game could simply have left it there, but the world of The Last of Us is a dark one, and Ellie is a complex character. Over the subsequent flashbacks, we see Ellie begin to doubt as to the kind of person Joel really is. What did he do to make sure she stayed alive? This ultimately culminates in a flashback where she visits the Firefly Hospital. The Fireflies were another paramilitary group who were going to use Ellie to create a vaccine for the cordyceps zombie plague that's infected the world. The catch, of course, being that the operation would cost Ellie her life. After exploring this hospital, Joel confesses to Ellie that to save her, he gunned every single person in his way down. And while she rides back home with him, she cuts him out of her life. And for a lot of the game, that's where it seems like things left off. Joel's death is all the sadder because these people who had such a close connection were broken apart before he was killed. This schism and this outlook is reinforced when Ellie, after the confrontation with Abby in the theater, decides to recommit to revenge. When she does, we get a flashback to a dance scene that happened the night before Joel was killed. At that dance, he intervened when a homophobic bigot decided to harass Ellie and Dina, which results in Ellie telling him to stay out of her life. This again recontextualizes Joel's death, because now not only do we see that their relationship broke, we as an audience and as a player also believe that the last thing Ellie said to Joel was for him to stay out of her life. And that guilt over those words is eating at her all the more after she escapes Abby and Seattle and starts a farmstead with Dina. To me, it was clear that Ellie really wanted to let her quest for revenge go. She was really happy. She had people who loved her. She really could have lived happily ever after. But her mind and her body will not let her let it go. Whether it's post-traumatic flashbacks that occur when loud noises occur around her, or through the nightmares that she has when she sleeps, she sees Joel's death over and over again. It replays in her mind, and there's nothing she can do to make it stop. She wants to let it go, but she physiologically can't. She has to see her journey through to its end, or she will never be able to rest. And so she chases Abby all the way to California, and in a gruesome, uncomfortable final confrontation, she manages to best her, and she starts drowning her in the waves. And it's in that moment, when Abby's life is literally in Ellie's hands, that we, as the player, catch a glimpse of the final flashback. Ellie's mind is no longer focused on the day Joel died. It's no longer zeroed in on that moment where he was killed. And so she lets Abby go. Unlike Abby, when Ellie is finally confronted with the person who killed her father, and she has the power to end it right there, she chooses forgiveness. And after that scene, when the game shows us that final flashback, we understand why she makes that choice. Later in the evening, that same night of the dance, Ellie and Joel had one last conversation. And in that conversation, Ellie tells Joel that she doesn't know if she can forgive him for what he's done. She doesn't know if she can forgive the fact that he killed all those people, or that he took her choice out of her hands. But she wants to try. She wants to try to have a relationship with him. So for the final time, our whole perception of Ellie's journey of revenge changes. Abby didn't just take away a father figure from Ellie, she took away what could have been, what might have been. Forgiveness. But in choosing to forgive Abby, Ellie is also choosing to forgive Joel. And that is why, even though she's lost so much, I think that at the end, Ellie's journey is a hopeful one. Because if she can forgive someone like Abby, then I have no doubt in my mind that the people she loves, like Dina and Tommy and the rest of the people in Jackson, could forgive her for her choices. Also, she hasn't actually lost her connection with Joel, because you can learn to play the guitar left-handed and then she'd be able to play it just fine. So long term, that's the solution. But in all seriousness, Ellie's journey through this game was so well crafted. I felt every bit of her rage and her sadness and her joy and her loss. Throughout The Last of Us Part 2, she is portrayed as a nuanced, complex, and deeply hurt character, and not enough will ever be said, I think can ever be said, about the performance given by Ashley Johnson, as well as the team of animators and character artists who brought that character of Ellie to life. Ellie is a profoundly realized human being, and walking in her shoes through the length of The Last of Us Part 2 is among one of the high points of narrative storytelling in big budget video games. When I started outlining this script, I did not realize that this talking point I'm about to get into would become such a big meme of a deal. But the fact remains, this was my opinion anyway. The Last of Us Part 2 is too long. Not because video games can't be as long or even longer than it is, but because there isn't enough video game in The Last of Us Part 2 to justify how long it is. For me, more than anything, by the end of the game, I'd really started to resent its gameplay. I resented how it got in the way of the game's story. I resented how repetitive it was. And more than anything, I resented the fact that it felt like it was there simply to extend the game's running time. The majority of my time in The Last of Us Part 2 wasn't spent engaging with a meticulously crafted story. No, instead the majority of my time was spent going through repetitive, laborious tasks as I traveled from one city block in Seattle to another. These repetitive city block journeys usually throw several combat encounters between where you are and your destination. And whether you're fighting humans or clickers, by about the halfway point of the game, there isn't really anything new that it can throw at you. So instead, it just throws more of them at you. And by that flaw, the bigger the groups you're fighting, the more tedious they are to fight. Not only that, but once you're done fighting in one of those areas, you're then practically required by the game to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes going through every single little detail of the environment to pick up and restock on all the supplies you'll have used to survive that combat encounter. Not to mention all of the different collectibles that are hidden through the environment. This gameplay loop flies in the face of the game's more story-driven aspects. Whether you're playing as Abby or Ellie, when you kill someone in one of these combat encounters, their friends will call out their names at the loss. No, poor David! No, poor Sandra! The game is also really brutal in its depiction of death, with characters gurgling in their own blood when you cut their throats in a stealth kill, or screaming in pain as you throw a pipe bomb at them. The game's story and its presentation all work towards making your character killing people feel uncomfortable and wrong, which is as it should be. But then the gameplay loop itself flies counter to that. To make sure that you're best equipped with the challenges the game throws at you, you are almost required to comb through the environments you pass through to make sure that you gather all of the collectibles you can find, to craft more ammo, better weapons, and even upgrade yourself to become a better or more stealthy killer. But the only way to safely and effectively scour through these areas in search of these resources is to kill every enemy in the area. So not only is the kill everything and then explore gameplay loop super tedious by the end of the game, it also flies in the face of the game's deeper narrative and thematic elements. That formula starts at hour 1 of the game and does not change at all throughout both characters' journeys, and it's the exact same at hour 30. To put it another way, there is simply not enough game to justify how long you're playing The Last of Us Part 2. And that really shouldn't be a problem because many of those kill and explore areas are not critical to the story in any way. In fact, many of those sections are comical obstacles that are thrown at you as you're trying to get through the story. The amount of times one of the characters you're playing will say something like, "It's just around the corner," or "It's right through that door right there," only for you to suddenly be ambushed, or for the floor to literally fall out from under you, or for that door to need a key that you need to go down into a basement to find. It's almost like Naughty Dog is parodying their gameplay style. And of course, this isn't unique to Naughty Dog. I had a similar piece of feedback when I did my God of War video. But it's so much worse here in The Last of Us Part 2. And this isn't just reflected in the gameplay. In Ellie's first part of the story, she doesn't find any of the people she set out to kill for a really long time. She goes to a bunch of locations where they're supposed to be, and it turns out, oh, it's the wrong location, or oh, they were here but now they're gone, or oh, they were here but now they're already dead. You're just chasing your tail over and over again through the gameplay loops and the narrative of the story. This "your princess is in another castle" trope reaches its nadir in this game when Abby goes to a hospital because she needs medical supplies. First of all, the journey to this hospital in and of itself was an ordeal where you had to go through several buildings full of zombie enemies. But you finally reach the hospital, you get a breath of fresh air. This hospital is full of Abby's friends, full of people she works with in the Wolves, and the medical supplies are apparently abundant there. But as soon as you get there, oh, your friends are not your friends anymore, and they arrest you, and by the time you break free, oh, it turns out all the medical supplies have been shipped away. Sorry. So now you have to go into the basement and fight zombies for another hour. And the climax of that section sees you facing off against this giant zombie blob boss that feels totally out of place in a video game whose story up until that point had really tried to sell itself on realism. This section of the game trades in that realism so much that it's actually the only place in the entire game where supplies will respawn. So if you need a bit of extra health to fight this boss, don't worry, the energy bar in the vending machine will respawn every 30 seconds. This never happens anywhere else in the game. And the thing is, with that section and a lot of these sections, is that they could all have been cut without any detriment to the story that Naughty Dog was trying to tell. In fact, cutting it and similar scenes would have made the game significantly better. So, once again, a really obvious story decision seems not to have been taken. So, again, speculatively, I can only assume that these sections remain there to pad out the game's length. Because ultimately, a video game is a commercial product, and for a large portion of players out there, a short runtime of a video game is something that is worth complaining about. If your game doesn't have a longer runtime, well, that makes it harder to sell. Like with setting Abby's portion of the story in the second half of the game, these non-story critical gameplay sections seem to only really be in there so that a sales executive could put a number at the back of the box. Or it could just simply be that Naughty Dog need better story editors on their team. But if there's someone I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt to, it's the creative teams and the artists behind the video game. That said, not every bad decision ever is because of a commercial or corporate interest. Sometimes people just make bad editing decisions. There isn't really a way for me or anyone else to know what drove these decisions, but what we can all conclude is that The Last of Us Part 2 as a narrative is hurt by its nature as a commercial product. The Last of Us Part 2 is a good game. Despite its deep flaws, it is a game that will make you think, and it will make you analyze your own interpretations of it afterwards. This is good. That it was willing to take such big risks bodes well for the future of storytelling in bigger budget AAA video games. It is not just surprising, but encouraging to see a major game studio take some big gambles and make some story decisions that might bother a lot of their audience. But for me, its AAA blockbuster pedigree is also what holds it back. It's like it only really half swung. It pulled the punch. If this game were a story only and not a product, I have no doubt in my mind that Abby's section of the story would have been structured differently. In the same way, there is no doubt in my mind that if story really came first, then the large sections of the game that are mostly devoid of story and feature a repetitive gameplay loop would have been cut. It's a game that, like its main characters, is at war with itself. But unlike its characters, The Last of Us Part 2 never really makes a choice. Through its whole running time, it is treading the line between being this commercial survival horror action product and being a more artful character study that takes deep looks at thematic questions and builds up these complex characters. By never choosing either side of that line, The Last of Us 2 stumbles. But that stumbling aside, my journey with Ellie through this game's story isn't one I'm bound to forget anytime soon. Okay, by the way, how the hell is Tommy alive at the end? Okay, Abby shoots him in the back of the head, and the other two characters who are still alive that he's with are also horribly injured. That means he somehow got enough medical attention to patch a gun wound in his head, and he then survived a several week-long journey back to Jackson without that wound getting infected, and then all he's left with is like this cool, gnarly scar? In a story where side characters like poor Jesse die all the time, he has got to be the luckiest man alive. I'll have what he's having.